Contrast. When we're talking about contrast in art, we are talking about things that look very different from each other. We've got lots of examples here. First one, what do you think are the differences here? One thing that you might notice is that this circle is much smaller than these circles. So this circle contrasts all the others because of its size difference. Also, something you might notice about this is the difference in values. So the lightness and darkness of the image. The circles are all white, the rest of it is black, and those things are very different from each other. And so it shows value contrast as well. This image, we got these big bricks and these little bricks. And what's the difference between them? One, maybe value contrast again. We've got light and dark. What's the other main difference that you see? Size, big and small. There's one more, texture contrast. This shows a rough texture and this is a much more smooth texture. So texture can show contrast as well. A similar thing is happening with this picture. More of a fine texture and more of a rough and chunky texture. So different textures shows contrast. We can also have color contrast. For example, complementary colors like blue and orange. Those are opposite colors on the color wheel, and they show contrast because they are very different from each other. Another example of texture contrast. Here's an interesting example for value contrast. Which of these inner rectangles do you think is darker? Most people think that this one looks darker, but in fact they're the same value. They look different because of what surrounds them. The dark surrounding this value of pink makes it look lighter. The light surrounding this same pink makes this one appear darker. Here we have an example of shape contrast. We have a geometric shape, a man-made shape, and organic shapes, or shapes that look like they come from nature. Shape contrast. Here's another example of color contrast. Size contrast. Value contrast. And here's a good example of why contrast is so important in art. If you have your drawing and it's gray on gray, then it's not going to be very easy to see. Nothing's going to really stand out. But either of these other examples here stand out really nicely because you've got something really dark and something really light. Apply that to your own drawings as well. Otherwise, it's going to be hard to see. And emphasis. Emphasis is very related to contrast, and you'll see why as we go through these. In emphasis, we want to have something that stands out, something that dominates the picture or catches your eye. In this picture, it's the starfish. It stands out because it shows contrast of shape or form, right? It's an organic shape compared to these, well, these are organic shapes too, but they're just very different shapes of the rocks. It stands out because it's lighter. All this other stuff is darker. So something that stands out is the point of emphasis or the focal point. Also, think about where this starfish is in the picture as we move on to the next one. This image is divided into thirds in both directions, and we use something called the rule of thirds to place a point of emphasis. So where do you think is the point of emphasis here? The front of the boat here is the point of emphasis because we've got this bright red tassel. We've got the front of the boat, which is bigger than the back of the boat from this view. It's the most important thing in this picture. Notice how the artist placed it on this intersection of the rule of thirds. They could have placed it here, here, or here, and that would have worked out too. But this is the most important part of the picture, and the artist used the rule of thirds to make the composition look interesting. Same thing here. If we divided this into thirds, we'd have one intersection right about here of those invisible lines, those imaginary lines. This is the thing that dominates the picture. It's the point of emphasis or the focal point. It's also on one of those intersections of the rule of thirds. On this picture, those 4 red dots show the intersections of the rule of thirds. And which one do you think is the most important point of emphasis here? Probably not between the eyes, probably not the cheek. Do you think it's the nose or the eye? Which one is more important in this image? I would say it's the eye. The eye is the most important part of the face. It's where we look when we look at a person. And this intersection here doesn't fall on the eye over here. So this one does. That's why it's the point of emphasis and not this eye. This eye is a little bit closer to us, plus the placement of it in the composition means that it is in a good visually appealing place for the composition using the rule of thirds. So in this case, this eye doesn't stand out a whole lot more than the rest of the picture, but because of where it is placed, I would call that the point of emphasis. If we go back to the starfish one, we've got the upper right intersection of the rule of thirds is where this starfish is placed. So that also uses the rule of thirds. In your project, I want you to try to use the rule of thirds in your drawing, and whatever you want to stand out, try to put it on one of those intersections where those lines, those imaginary lines, don't actually draw them, but those imaginary lines, where they intersect, that's where to put your focal point.